Hey, there he is.
How are you?
Hey, Jordan, good to see you.
It's great to see you as well. How's everything?
It's going all right. Going all right
Good,
here.
good. Are you still up in New Hampshire?
Yeah, I live in the more northern part along the Connecticut River,
Okay.
um, right across the river from Vermont. And
Well, it's pretty up there. I couldn't do the winters, but it is pretty up that way.
yeah, well, the last few winters haven't been bad at all. But
I bet. Sadly, I think that's
yeah,
that's
yeah,
not good news.
we rely heavily on snowfall, and we haven't had very
Mm-hmm.
good snowfall at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So you've
Well,
had an interesting life. What I want to do today is talk about your Mowgli experience, but also um, get into what you've done since Mowgli.
sure.
Uh, some of the awards that you've received, and the more important, the work that you've done that led to those
All
awards.
right.
Because that your dad gave me quite a list of things, and some of them I actually was able to find on YouTube. And
Oh, okay. All
yeah, it
right.
was really
Well, listen, I'm gonna let you drive this train. So you start a conversation and I'll jump in where I
all
can.
right. That sounds like a plan. I am speaking with Jordan Kranis. Jordan, what year did you come to Mowgli?
Oh boy, what year would I have started? I don't remember specifically. I was about 7 or 8 years old, so it was probably around 1980, maybe even 1979 when I started as a cub. I was in the Cubs, and my older brother, he and I started the same year. He started, I want to say, his first year he was probably in Toomai or Aquila, maybe. I don't recall, but I would say about 1979 or 1980.
From your perspective, how was it that you came to Mowgli to begin with?
So my parents, Jay and Joanne Kranis, both of them had grown up in Brooklyn, New York, and they were longtime friends of the Sprung family. Um, and so Jason Sprung, and gosh, I'm forgetting his brother's name. That's embarrassing. I apologize for that. In any event, my parents were introduced to the idea of Mowgli through the Sprung family. And they were invited, I don't know if it's still done, but they used to do these sort of in cities, they'd have these little meetings where they'd try to introduce new people to the camp. And my parents went to that, and they were intrigued by the idea of Mowgli through the Sprungs, and that's how we ended up going. Was thanks to Larry Sprung was the
Larry,
brother.
right? Yep,
Yep,
yep.
Larry Sprung. So anyway, that we were introduced to the camp through the Sprung family, they had already been going to the camp.
So was it a real culture shock for you to go from city life to
Well,
Mowgli?
Well, in a million ways, yes. My family, when we were young, we would do the occasional camping trip, meaning we'd go out and, to a campground that had, we'd spend a few days out there. But as you mentioned, I was very much a city kid. I grew up in the heart of New York City in Manhattan and was very much a creature of the concrete jungle, I guess you would say. So going up to New Hampshire and being thrown into this very much of a sort of a wilderness lifestyle was I guess a culture shock, although the truth is I was young enough to where it was like, oh, this is cool. I haven't done this before. So I immediately, I was very young. I think about how young I was when I first went there. And again, I think I was 6 or 7 years old. Um, and so I think I was young enough where it was just like, oh, this is a new experience. This should be fun. Um, and so yes, culture shock definitely, but I loved it. I loved it from day one.
what do you remember of your earlier years at Mowgli? Like, who were the cub parents? And
Well, I remember Don Merrill was the counselor that I became closest with.
uh-huh.
And I really, really had an attachment to him. I knew that he had a brother there, Doug, but I felt very sort of, my brother was at the camp as well, and I was aware of that, but I felt very separated because the Cubs really, at least at the time, had a very sort of isolated experience with the younger kids. So so Don Merrill was really important to me, and also the Browns, Mr. and Mrs. Brown, were the parents at the time. And I also remember they had a daughter named Wendy Brown
Oh, sure. Yeah,
who
Wendy.
I had a little bit of a crush on maybe when I was 7 and 8 years old. I remember that very well. Um, but yeah, I just remember it feeling sort of isolated from the rest of the camp, and not in a bad way, just almost like a different entity, almost in a way, because we really did everything just by ourselves. But it was great. Like I said, I took a liking to it immediately. Somehow I look back on it now, and I was really young. But for whatever reason, didn't think twice about the fact that I was going to be, 8 hours away from home for 8 weeks. It just didn't strike me as strange. Where I look back at it now, and like I think of what I've sent my son when he was that old away for that long, and I don't know that I would have done it, but maybe it was just a different time, and that's what we did back then.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the Browns, of course, were institutions at Mowgli, and
Sure, sure.
the Merrill brothers. I mean, they
As
started as little kids.
as much an institution as the Browns, I
Sure,
would argue. I
sure.
mean, the
Yeah,
Merrills, and by the way, I was in Cubs, I think, for a couple of seasons. Um, but immediately when I went down to this sort of grown-up kids camp, and got to know Doug Merrill, he also, the two of them really are in my heart as true Mowgli, and really made my experience really, really memorable, both of them.
yeah,
In a way, I kind of, because Don was still up with the Cubs, and so I sort of missed him when I was in with the older kids in a way, but Doug kind of filled that role for me also. So
sure.
so yeah, they're the two of them, and it's not like I occasional like Facebook messages or something, but haven't really seen them, but they still hold a very deep place in my heart.
Yeah. So making the transition down into the full camp was that difficult for you because you didn't have quite the
I don't think
attention?
so. I don't think so. I think I grew up a little bit. I was a little bit older. I think there was sort of you feel like you're a grown up in some way, so you're moving on to the next level. I still had my brother there, I believe, for 1 year when I was in the full camp. He was still there for 1 year. I want to say he was in Panther that summer. So there was some comfort there. But no, I loved it. And I had grown close to a lot of the people, Ben Ringe and some of the other guys that I was in the Cubs with. They were also there. So it was comfortable for me. I loved it, in fact, and it felt like this big new world where the Cubs were sort of in this isolated, smaller part of the camp. Suddenly, there was more freedom to move around, and there were the tennis courts and the basketball court and the waterfront and all of these. It just felt much bigger and more exciting, I think.
Yeah. And were were there industries, the activities that you took a particular interest in right away, or?
Um, it's funny to think back. I kind of dove into all of it. I mean, I got a lot of ribbons, and which means that I was really taking advantage of all that it had to offer.
Yeah.
And so certainly, I mean, look, I was a city kid, and so basketball was something that I could do at home very easily. You just go to the park. So I played a lot of basketball, and I remember the rim was a little bit low, and I was able to dunk at a at a somewhat young age. So that was fun. But I also played a lot of tennis. I mean, tennis was one thing that I was doing at home also, and so I played a lot of tennis. Played with Penn Herring and a bunch of other people who were also very into it. But I also loved the canoeing, and I love I love to swim, I got to swim a Wangunga and all of these things at what felt like a pretty young age. I was getting to do all of these things that I'd heard about from my brother, and now I was getting to do them. So I did them all. I did, my axemanship and my getting my green ribbon and all of these camping things, and also some of the more traditional sports like basketball and tennis. Um, so I really think that I took advantage of everything that the camp had to offer. And I didn't isolate myself to one specific thing.
Yeah, I certainly remember, every Sunday night, the staff had these very serious staff meetings where you would discuss, how kids were doing, and
Mhm.
if there were issues that we needed to pay particular attention to. And I'm afraid to say that you got glossed over quite commonly because everybody just said this kid is competent as hell, and we don't have to worry about him. He's doing great.
I do remember feeling just comfortable there. I didn't have any sort of homesickness issues. I wasn't, thankfully, I don't think of myself as a shy kid. I dove into whatever activity it was. I would talk to whomever. I remember looking up to a lot of the older campers and thinking they were really cool and I wanted to be in with them. And so and wasn't shy about kind of introducing myself, being myself around people, and they seemed to be largely accepting of me. So that was exciting for me. So I guess it was, I don't know to what I attribute that comfort level, but I just was comfortable there. People seemed to accept me, and I was outgoing enough to really get to know people as well as possible and get close with people and dive into activities I'd never done before. Um, so yeah, I feel fortunate that I was willing to do those things and not be shy or apprehensive about anything, and also the fact that people accepted me, you know, made it for a very comfortable experience for me and allowed me to
Yeah.
really dive into all of these activities that I wouldn't have been able to do in New York City.
Now I know I'm asking you to really think back on uh, what it was like with your other friends, from your non-camp friends, but did you feel as if the experience that you had each summer um, was sort of an opportunity for you to develop an independence that you didn't see in your cohorts in elementary school?
You know, it's a good question. Um, in New York City or I would say the tri-state area, I guess, summer camps for most kids were different than Mowgli, in that it was like, okay, we're going to summer camp and you're going to play soccer from 11 to 1, and then from 2 to 4 you're going to go swimming, and then you're going to play basketball. And Mowgli was very different, and they had really unique activities that we were doing, and it didn't feel like we were just being sent somewhere where counselors could watch us do the things that we would do when we were back home anyway.
Sure.
These were activities that I wouldn't have gotten to do. Axemanship was not something that was on the table for me if I spent the summer in New York City, or if I went to one of the camps that were in Pennsylvania or closer by that a lot of the kids went to. So I do think in that regard, Mowgli, I don't know. In some way, I feel like it was teaching us to be men in a different way than I might have experienced had I gone to one of these other camps that were, I don't want to say generic, but just um again, doing activities that I might have done if I was back at home, or went to one of the local camps around New York City, that, it was just like we almost had like sort of babysitters just watching us play soccer. At Mowgli, it gave me an opportunity to do things really unique and to mature in a way that I don't think I would have otherwise.
Well, in a little bit, we're going to talk about some of the incredible stuff that you've done in your professional life, but I want to sort of attach myself to that as I ask you this next question, which is, did you feel a change in your level of personal confidence as a result of your summers at Mowgli?
I'm, well, look, for better or worse, I think that I was always a confident kid, which is, I think,
Yeah.
probably what allowed me to feel, like I said, my I was leaving home for 8 weeks at a very, very young age, and I don't remember thinking for 2 seconds that this was a big deal. Like I
Uh-huh.
was like, okay, this is what I'm doing now. So I think my inherent confidence, whatever you would call it, allowed me to do it without concern and without fear, and allowed me to dive into the activities in the way that I did there. But certainly being there, and look, Mowgli had a lot of sort of goals that you could set. I want to get this ribbon, or I want to get into the inner circle because I got X number of ribbons, or I want to make the Mount Washington squad, whatever it was. There were sort of these honors that you could strive for. And I did. They were important to me. So I think that I had an inherent confidence going in, but Mowgli allowed me to stretch that and really try to achieve goals.
Mhm.
And that was big for me because I look back on it, and I really, really wanted to get a taste of everything there. And it pushed me to put myself into situations that I'd never been in before. And like I'd never been in a canoe before. I'm gonna go learn how to be in a canoe. I never rode in a a crew boat. I wanted to do it. I saw the older kids doing it. I said, I want to do that. I want to get in. I want to one day be in the racing crew. So it definitely taught me to want to achieve. I think that was a big part of it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that separates Mowgli from a lot of other camps is the structure of achievement that has been developed over the years. I mean, you have a on in each area of proficiency, you have a chart on the wall that has
Yeah.
your name and all of the requirements for actually achieving your ribbon, which is the ultimate goal. Um, and uh, a lot of camps are just, they're great fun oriented,
Right.
but there isn't the structure there to help you develop as a person to the extent that there is at Mowgli, I think.
Yeah. And also it holds you personally accountable for it, because I want to achieve that, and the only way that I can achieve this ribbon or that honor, or be recognized and put on the Mount Washington squad is to go out and do it myself. It was on me to do things enough to be recognized for my achievements, and to
Mhm.
be to get that sense of satisfaction for having done something. And like you said, other camps, I'm sure they're great and I'm sure they're fun, but you know, soccer on Tuesday from 11 to 1, anybody's going to do that, and there's nothing, there's no sense of like, okay, I'm going to do this because I want to better myself so that I can get to this level and then get to this level. And so Mowgli in like you said, the structure of it is such that it taught me or pushed me to want to achieve and to be recognized for those achievements.
Well, you were certainly recognized for that even as a very young boy, you know, among the staff. Um, and since I have a few years on you, I was on the staff and in some
Indeed.
of those years. Um, what's was there aside from squads, was there a particular trip that is really emblazoned in your memory?
Gosh, you know, I wouldn't be able to point to one. I
Uh-huh.
do remember, especially in my earlier years, one of the things that I loved was even on the day trips that we would take to go climb Mount Cardigan, whatever it was. I loved it. It was, again, this is something that was foreign to me as a city kid, but I loved it. And one of the things that I loved the most is I remember a lot of the times we could pick blueberries, for example. And God, did I love bringing back a big sack of blueberries, because then I remember the next day I was going to get blueberry pancakes for breakfast if we brought back enough blueberries.
Yeah.
And so I don't know that there's a particular trip that we took, but it was climbing a mountain and getting the views. Even as a young kid, I remember being blown away by getting to the top of a mountain after a long hike and getting to look over this vista that I definitely didn't get in New York City. And, I'm sure there was some sense of achievement, but there was just also a sense of awe, because I didn't wasn't something I did in my everyday. There were some people up that lived up in that part of the United States that probably were more familiar with. I remember John Gillert was one of the people
Yeah. Yeah.
in my year. He was from New Hampshire, so I think a lot of this stuff wasn't new to him. For me, it was all new. So to get to climb a mountain on a Thursday and come back, and you've got your big thing of blueberries and you can't wait till the next morning because you're going to bring them to the kitchen and they're going to make you blueberry muffin or blueberry pancakes in the morning. It was really exciting for me. I loved it. I loved it.
Now, among, I'm sure that there were, you had a lot of friends, but were there any, who were your besties in your dorm?
Um, Gosh, so Ben Ringe, certainly we called him Benji at the time, but he's grown out of that, I think, like these days. So Ben Ringe definitely was one of the people I was closest with. Fitzhugh Yateman was another guy that I was very, very close with. There was a kid named Alex Stant that I was very good friends with. Paul Beckford, I was very close with. Listen, you go from year to year, especially for the kids that I had come from when we were in the Cubs, and grow all the way up through the years. Gordon Tapley, and so there's a lot of people, many of whom unfortunately I've lost touch with, some of whom I'm still in touch with. But I would say those are the names: Ben
Yeah.
Ringe and Fitzhugh and Paul Beckford and Alex Stant, who I remember he had an older brother who I always looked up to.
Yeah. Yeah. And the the Merrill brothers were obviously
The
high on your
Merrills,
radar list among the
very,
staff.
yeah, I just, I don't know what it was, and I don't know that I necessarily had a unique relationship with them. They may have had the same relationship with a lot of us campers, but for whatever reason, I felt like they took me in and and really looked after me and cared about me, and I just admire him. Jan Grevin was another guy who I just thought he was so cool. He was
Yeah.
so cool. And the fact that he would take me in and treat me well and consider me a you know, an equal in some way, even though I was a little bit younger, I was an equal to him. I remember he was my crew leader one year that I was on racing crew, and I just thought it was so cool that I got to, and because I was on racing crew, maybe I got a little bit more attention from Jan that week than some of the other guys, and I felt great about that. So, um, I remember there was a counselor named Jim Graff who I really admired a lot. He was somebody that I looked up to a lot. There were
Yeah.
a lot of people, a lot of people who I think my admiration for them made me want to stand out in some way, you
Yeah.
know.
Well, you were a very spirited guy, and so I'm going to ask you, did you ever end up on the director's porch for misbehaving?
Oh, did I do that? I did do that, yes. In fact, one of my, this was not a happy memory, but Fitz Yateman had a younger brother. I want to say his name was Duffy
Yep. Yep.
Yateman. And I don't remember, to be honest, I don't remember what sparked the incident, but I threw back and punched Duffy
Oh,
for some, I don't, again, don't recall why.
yeah.
And I felt terrible about it. I mean, it was a really bad, um, you know, I'll talk about that in a minute. I had my share of incidents growing up in New York and getting in fights in school and things like that. That was the only time at camp that I ever did where I got in a physical altercation and I got in real trouble for it, as I should have. It was totally inappropriate. And so I ended up with Mr. Bankston. He was not happy with me, again, for very good reason. And I felt particularly terrible because I was so close with Fitz that I had this incident with his brother, and that was, yeah, not my finest hour, put it that way. So yes, I had my share. I think I was a little bit of a loudmouth probably when I was younger. My confidence maybe got the better of me at times.
Hmm.
But yes, I was no stranger to getting in a little bit of trouble at camp, unfortunately.
Any fun stories about pranks that you pulled or?
Pranks, gosh, I don't remember, I don't remember pranks necessarily.
Yeah.
I felt very fortunate that I got along with pretty much everybody. I don't remember anyone that I didn't get along with. And so it was all just fun for me. It was all just shared experiences. And again, I don't, pranks I don't recall pulling. I'm sure I did plenty of dumb shit while I was there, but I don't remember pranks necessarily. I just remember feeling very much a part of the group, a part of both in my year, the kids that I was with, and also beyond that, I was felt at least friendly with some of the older kids. So that felt good. Um, I just felt a part of the collective fun that we all had,
Right.
and collectively growing up together. Yeah, it was just a really great, for whatever reason, my brother didn't take to the experience in the same way I did, so I ended up staying at camp for longer than he did.
Hmm.
Um, but um, but yeah, I just had a wonderful experience at camp, and it was very, listen, camp, smallish camp. I was one of the very few Jewish campers there. I grew up Jewish, um, and so there was the possibility, I suppose, of feeling like somewhat of an outcast. I never did for 1 second. I happily took part in the chapel ceremonies. I think I even one summer was part of the glee club that went to churches and sang there. So no, I was accepted there, and that's really what made the experience so rich for me.
Yeah. Now, crew was an incredibly important part of your
It,
experience.
it was a
Talk.
big it was a big deal for me. Being the crew week was a big, like I said, there was this idea of achievement at camp that I wanted to achieve. I wanted to get the ribbons and everything else. And certainly being on crew teams was a big, big deal for me. That felt like, for me, and probably for a lot of other kids, crew week was a culmination in some ways of what your entire summer was about. And so I never was in a crew boat in my life before Mowgli. And for whatever reason, I had some facility with it. I was able to do it. And so I remember my first year I was on the third team. I forgot what the
The
names of the
forms, yeah.
third form, and I was the stroke of the third form, and that was a huge deal for me. You know, I'm sure the older kids would have looked back on it and poo-pooed it, but for me, it was a big deal. I got to be the
Sure.
stroke on the third form, you know. And then the next year, I jumped up. I jumped up to the first form, and that was exciting. Oh my God, I skipped a form. I must be doing something right. So that was another big deal. And then you feel even more a part of crew week the higher you go up in the on the boats. And then we won my third form year, we won my first form year, and then the next year I was on the racing crew as the stroke, and boy, we felt good. We felt like we were really good, and we won racing crew that year, which was everything. It really, really, uh, you know, it's funny because I feel like Mowgli doesn't really teach competition necessarily. You know, it's about achievement, but not necessarily against someone else. But for that 1 week, you feel like you've got a team and you want to represent your team and you want to bring home the win so that your team can get excited. And so I was able to win those first 3 years, and that was a big deal for me. I mean, those are some really, really great memories. In fact, Ben Ringe, a couple of years back, sent some photos from our first year on racing crew together because he was right behind me in the boat. So we busted our asses. And I remember the first year having won, his parents had taken photos of us when we got back to the dock, and we're celebrating and we're hugging, and I'm hugging Doug Merrill because he was the crew leader, and and so I have these unbelievable moments in photos that I have to reflect on. And it genuinely brings back this sense of emotion that you had in that moment. So those were huge for me. And then in my den year, I was again on the racing crew, and after a lot of winning that I'd done up to that point, I had full expectation, well, we're going to do it again. And of course, it didn't happen my last year there. And it was a massive disappointment to to get to the end of it and realize that, well, this is my last opportunity to do this because I'm not going to be a camper anymore. And so that was a massive, massive disappointment for me to lose to the Red Crew that year. Ultimately, it worked out okay, and I have very good memories of it. But that was tough because crew was a huge part of my Mowgli experience.
As you know, I interviewed your dad a few months ago about this, and he particularly reflected on that year that you lost. And I'd love to get your own reaction to that because he saw that as I think opening his eyes to the growth experience that you had had at Mowgli. But how did you see it?
Yeah, I think that's an experience that I reflect on a lot, even as an adult, because like I said, the winning had become such a part of my experience there that I felt like I should always be winning. This is just what we do. The Blue Crew goes out and we beat their butts, and we get to, and there's the tradition of the winning racing crew team gets to bring their oar back up to the field, and we raise the oar on the flagpole, and everyone is admires the winners and everything. And so as I mentioned, I did not win my den year, and so it was soul crushing to me down at the waterfront, and I was crying, and it was just brutal. But on the walk back up from the waterfront to the field, I really did have a revelation that I had won. I had an opportunity to experience that. And these friends makes me emotional.
Yeah.
these friends who mean a lot to me hadn't experienced that.
Yep.
And so I did have, I realized on the walk back, like they get to experience that. They get to experience that joy that I had experienced before. And I was happy for them. Guys like Fitz Yateman and Paul Beck, these guys who really meant a lot to me, were gonna get to experience the thing that I experienced. And I do think that was a product of my time at Mowgli, that I was able to, take a step back and realize how valuable that would be for people that I really cared about. So yes,
Yeah.
that was an important moment for me. Sorry
So yeah, it
about
was a
my
huge
emotion.
personal growth moment for you and for your dad. He it wasn't a personal growth moment for him, but it was a revelation for him to
Yeah,
see this boy that he loved and was very proud of uh, show the kind of empathy toward his friends that you showed.
yeah. It
And
was it was an important moment in my life that, it's got to be some 40 years later, and as you can see, it still has an impact on me.
yep, still resonates.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it really
yeah,
does. Yeah, and I'm glad that 40 years later, those guys get to have that feeling.
right, right. And
Sorry, I didn't
no,
intend to get emotional.
do not apologize. I can't tell you the number of times that I've had to choke back the same tears
Yeah,
in recounting various things.
yeah.
And what about squads?
Well, I was fortunate to be named to both. Obviously Washington Squad was the one you're really striving for, but I was fortunate to have been named to both of them. My last year I was on the Washington Squad, and again it goes back to this idea of striving for achievement and being then recognized for having strived for those achievements. So you know, we had some brutal weather, I remember, up on Mount Washington, but it was all worth it. It's a grueling experience, but there's something about this idea of having, especially for those of us who had been at the camp for a long time and grew up watching people be honored and get their picture taken with their packs before they head out, and those are the guys that you're like, wow, look at that. Well, now I got to be one of those people, and I
Yeah,
got to experience what they had experienced, and feel like I had achieved. That was a big part of it. Achieved, but also be recognized for my efforts. The squads were great. I mentioned earlier, the inner circle was always a big deal for me. How quickly can I earn enough ribbons so that I can get in that inner circle around the
mhm,
campfire? That was a big deal because I remember as a young camper sitting on the outer circle and looking there and say, I want to be on one of those one day. And so these were big deals for me.
yeah,
And the fact that I was able to get there on so many of them,
yeah,
or a Ka award, or, things of that nature, were just a big deal for me. One thing I'm talking about a lot of successes that I had. One thing because I played a lot of tennis, and one thing I didn't get to achieve at Mowgli was win the tennis tournament. That
uh-huh,
really, to this day, that still bothers me because boy, did I love playing tennis. It's funny, talking about a growth moment for myself. I remember one summer I was in the tennis finals, and I wish I could remember who I was playing against in the finals. I don't recall. But I remember I was trying to play this very aggressive style to try to win the tennis cup. and and I was, every time I would hit the ball hard and go up to the net and try to, attack, the person I was playing would just lob it over my head and I wouldn't get back there. And I remember after my parents happened to be there that weekend, it was a visiting weekend, and I was crying. And pissed off and upset. He keeps lobbing it over my head. And my father and my mother were like, "What are you crying? You're playing a game. You got to go out and play. He's going to do what he has to do to win. You're going to do what you." And when they said that to me, I said, "You know what? You're right. I'm acting like a child right now. Get out there and play." I didn't end up winning, unfortunately, but I did grow up a little bit and realize you can't cry your way to anything. You've got to just man up and do what you have to do. And sometimes you win, and sometimes you don't win.
It sounds like your mom and dad were very good at recognizing those touchstones and giving you good, solid advice.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, I think that when you're growing, you grow up with the people around you that are around you. You can't do much about it. And I guess I was fortunate in a lot of ways. I had an older brother that I admired a lot. My parents I admired a lot. I had my sister who was at Onaway for a few years. We're still very close, obviously. So I don't know that I was even aware necessarily of the things that my parents were doing to help me grow into a man. I honestly don't think I was aware of them when they were happening. I think that they must have done a very good job of setting me in the right direction, you know? Um, because for example, the thing, where I lost the racing crew in my den year and I was crushed by it. I don't know that it was necessarily anything that my parents said to me on that long walk back up from the waterfront to the field to raise the red oar. I don't think it was anything that they necessarily said to me. I just, somehow the empathy was in there, and I'm sure it was something that they had set in motion from when I was a very young person, you know.
Yeah. So, okay. So after Mowgli, did you come back as a staff member?
I never did. No, I
Okay.
never came back as
So
staff.
tell us about, college and your school experiences, and then we'll get into your professional experiences.
Okay, well, I guess so. I went to high school in New York City. I went to a place called Bronx High School of Science, which is a very good school. And I was surrounded by very, very high achieving people, higher achieving than I was, certainly. And I did fine, but a lot of that was a lot of 1600s on their SATs and Ivy League schools and all of that. That was not me in high school. I kind of figured out how to do enough to get by. So I did that. I played basketball in high school. Certainly was not at a level where I was going to play in college, so that wasn't a concern. Um, and eventually went to the University of Miami, down in Florida. Um, and while I was there, I was a broadcasting and English major. And when I finished school, I kind of hung around Miami for a couple of years, bartending, doing not a whole lot. And then at some point, a year and a half or two after I graduated, I realized, okay, now it's time to go do something with myself. And so I moved back to New York, where I'd grown up. And I was very fortunate. We had a family friend who worked in the television world. And so I got an interview to work for what was at the time a new cable channel that had not yet launched. It was called Classic Sports Network, which was, the idea of it was we would air old classic sporting events. So whether it was Muhammad Ali fights or a great Super Bowl or a memorable World Series game or whatever it was. So I got an interview there, and I was very fortunate to get the job, because I'm a huge sports fan, and so this fit right into my wheelhouse. And I got to be surrounded by the sports world and working in television and learning. And So I worked at Classic Sports Network for about 4 or 5 years and worked my way up from being a PA and the guy who ran around the city grabbing footage from this vendor or that vendor, and learned how to be a producer. And so I started working on various, various shows, various things in the sports world. And for example, I worked on a documentary about Muhammad Ali, who became a hero of mine. I fell in love with him during this time because I was old enough at the time to be aware of who Muhammad Ali was, but not old enough to really remember him as the fighter that he was.
Right.
So this job allowed me to, I I um I really immersed myself in boxing, which I was, like many people at the time, I was a boxing fan in as much as, like, if Mike Tyson was fighting on a weekend, I would get together with buddies and we'd watch Mike Tyson, but I didn't really know much about it beyond that. And so I really immersed myself in the boxing world, fell very much in love with it, even more the characters in the sport, even more so than the actual sport itself, Muhammad Ali being the biggest character. So
Right.
I fell very much in love with Muhammad Ali and did a documentary about him. And I was fortunate to get an opportunity to meet him and interview him, which was a
Wow.
which was a enormous moment in my life. In fact, I have a photo with him and me from back in those days that is hangs in my home now. It's really, in fact, you can probably see back here, there's a
Oh yeah,
picture
I
of
see
Muhammad
him.
Ali. Anyway, so Muhammad Ali became a very big part of my life. I did a documentary about him. Um, and eventually Classic Sports Network was bought by ESPN. And so ESPN decided, we were based in New York City. Classic Sports Network was based in New York City. ESPN moved it up to Connecticut, and I was a city kid. I didn't want to go live in Connecticut, up in Bristol, where ESPN is based. So I stayed behind and essentially became a freelance producer. And so for several years, I was producing sports documentaries for places like ESPN and HBO and places like that, and Madison Square Garden Network, which is the network that the Knicks and the Rangers play on. I was doing documentary series for them. I worked at a cable network called Oxygen, which I don't even know if it's still around anymore, but it was sort of a female-based cable network, and I was in the sports division there, so I did that for a few years. Um, and then eventually I had met someone in California. She eventually moved to New York. We eventually got married, but with this idea that she would like to get back to Los Angeles at some point. And so in 2007, we'd had, our son was about 3 years old at the time. We collectively decided we're going to move back to California, where she was from. And so that's when I left New York and moved to Los Angeles. And what I discovered in Los Angeles is that there was less of this sort of sports documentary world, and more of the reality TV world, which was relatively new at the time. But my documentary skills were sort of transferable to this reality world because you're dealing with things that are really happening and not scripted stuff. And so that's when I shifted into the reality TV world. And so I've since been doing that out here in Los Angeles, doing a lot of I've done a lot of shows, but some that you may have heard of are American Ninja Warrior and Hell's Kitchen and Kitchen Nightmares and Pros versus Joes. A lot of reality shows that are based here in Los Angeles, and I'm currently working on a show called Big Brother, which is sort of a reality competition show.
Now, the what was the name of the movie for which you received sort of the penultimate award?
Well, I've been thankful and fortunate to win 2 Emmys.
Oh, two.
One of them was for a documentary series I did for HBO, which this is embarrassing, I'm forgetting the name of it. Oh, it was called Legendary Nights. So Legendary Nights was a series of 8 separate documentaries highlighting the first 30 years of HBO sports, or HBO boxing rather. So we did a, whether it was the Holyfield Bow fights or Bogalada or Julio Cesar Chavez. We did a documentary about some of the great moments in
Mhm.
HBO boxing history over the first 30 years that they covered boxing. So I won an Emmy for that, which was exciting. And then I also, uh, currently on ESPN, there is a sports documentary series. The name escapes me again, so I'm embarrassed to forget the name of it, but the original concept for it was something called Sports Century. So toward the end of the last century, they looked back on the 20th century and the great moments, characters, legendary moments, or games or what have you. So I did a couple of documentaries for that series for ESPN, and also won a documentary for that. That was sort of, I think that Emmy was collectively for the series itself, not necessarily one that I specifically did, but I did uh, a couple of episodes of that, and so we collectively won an Emmy for that as well.
Now, the one that I watched on YouTube had to do with a college team, as I recall.
So I was nominated for an Emmy. I did not win for that
Oh,
one.
okay.
That one I was nominated for. That was called Perfect Upset for eight. Again, this was for HBO. That was reflecting back on the 1985 NCAA championship basketball game between Georgetown and Villanova. And
Right.
so it was the 20th anniversary of that game. So HBO did this, or I produced a documentary looking back on that sort of very, very one of the most memorable championship games of all time. So that one was called Perfect Upset.
Yes, and I'll put a link to that in
Okay.
our podcast so people can see it, because it was really very well done and enjoyable.
Well, thank you. I that was one that I particularly loved because it highlighted. And in fact, up in the New Hampshire area and the Northeast, um, it featured a lot of Big East basketball teams, and so that's what I grew up and fell in love with, was Big East basketball, Georgetown and Villanova and St. John's and Syracuse and all of these teams from the
Right.
Northeast. That was the era in which I fell in love with basketball. So all of the guys that I was interviewing for the documentary were heroes of mine. They were guys that I grew up watching. So I got to interview Patrick Ewing and Chris Mullin and Mark Jackson and all, just all of these guys that I had grown up falling in love with basketball watching. So that was really exciting for me. It's funny because I loved that documentary. And I actually thought when I went to the Emmys that year, I thought I had a good shot. Turned out that I lost to a documentary about double Dutch. So you never know.
I remember that. Yeah,
You never know.
funny that, yeah, it was such an odd thing to
Yeah.
see a documentary about that winning an
Win
Emmy
win
award.
the award.
Yeah,
But hey, I'm sure they did a great job.
yeah, yeah. Well, so uh, two Emmy awards and probably more than just that one nomination. Um,
Yeah,
have
I've been very fortunate. I've been very fortunate. It's funny, the show that I work on now, which again is called Big Brother, is a show that has a pretty rabid following. Not everybody loves it, but the people who love it really, really love it.
right, right.
And it's actually because of the format of it, where we're airing 3 1-hour episodes each week for about for the duration of the summer, basically about 100 days. And we're shooting 24 hours a day, and basically every 2 days or so we're grinding out another episode that goes on the air. It's really it's a grind, but we get it done, and I think we do a great job of it, and I think our editors do a great job of it, and there's a lot of people that love it, but for whatever reason, we never get recognized by the Emmys. So what are
Wow.
you gonna do?
Yeah. Interesting. And you mentioned several times if you will, Ben Ringe. I
Hmm.
still call him Benji, by the way.
Yeah, yeah. It took me a while to shake that habit.
But have you obviously you're in similar circles professionally.
We've never actually worked together,
Uh-huh.
but we're certainly in the same circles. He's on the East Coast, I'm in California, so that's probably part of it.
Yeah.
Um, but we're in the same circles. He and I are in touch fairly often, actually. In fact, about probably a week or a week and a half ago, I just was on the phone with him. Um, and I would say, of all of the people that I was friends with back in camp, he's the person that I probably was closest to then. And in fact, I will tell you, I actually believe that part of the reason that I do what I do is because, not necessarily because of Ben, but Ben's father, Buzz Ringe.
Oh yeah.
Because
Yeah.
Buzz Ringe, he worked for NFL Films. And I remember during several summers, he would come up to camp and we would get in Gray Brothers and he would play us NFL Films shows. And I was mesmerized by these shows. I really was taken with the whole idea
Yeah.
of, and NFL Films is notoriously the best at what they do. And so I fell in love with these times that his dad would come up and bring films for us to watch. If it was a rainy day, we'd get to watch his NFL films. And I actually think that that had a lot to do with why I ended up going into what I do, was because of these fond memories that I had of watching these things, particularly in sports. I was lucky enough to get into sports television, and it really, I think, links back to those days that Ben's dad would come up with those films. So, but that said, Ben and I still are in touch frequently. Um, and it's nice, when he comes out to California, we'll get together for dinner. I've introduced him to some people out here that I know that trying to maybe he wants to work together with. So yeah, that's a relationship that I really, really value. He's been a close friend for a long time. In fact, I remember, not a camp related experience, but one time Ben and I got jobs at the US Open, which is played in Queens in New York. So Ben stayed with my family. This was after the camp season,
Yeah.
and we went to work at the US Open together. That's another thing that I really look back on fondly, and a memory that I'll never forget is getting to do that with him.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, you have had a very storied career, and you were a pretty storied kid at Mowgli. Uh, what a blessed life you have led, my friend.
In many
Um,
ways, I agree, and I thank you for that. And I I do credit Mowgli in a lot of ways for becoming the adult that I eventually became. A lot of the values that I learned, and the hard work that I learned, and the dedication to, whether it's family or work or whatever it is, I think I credit a lot of that to my experience at Mowgli.
yeah, yeah,
It really is a place to um, that turns people into men, and young boys into men. I really
yeah,
believe that.
right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jordan,
This
for
was a pleasure.
spending
It's
this time
oh,
with me.
thank you for inviting me. It's always fun for me to look back on those Mowgli days. And Ben has many times invited me to come up to camp for Crew Week, which is something that I would love, love, love to do. Unfortunately, it conflicts with the show that I work on, and the show that I produce is a summer show, so it's impossible for me to get away for that time period. But boy, would I love one day to get back up there and spend a few days up there, and soak in the Mowgli and the lake and the whole thing, and again get to experience Crew Week, which is just one of the great memories of my life.
Yeah. Well,
Go
good
Blue Crew.
hunting, my brother.
Good
It was
hunting.
wonderful talking with you.
Thanks so much, Wayne. Great to see you.
Take care.
Thank you.